I never expected Thanksgiving to become a family trial, with chairs circled for a rigged vote. My mother wanted everyone to raise hands, cutting me out of the family and an inheritance she claimed I did not deserve. I stayed silent, letting them believe I had no defense, but when the last hand went up, I played one recording and opened a single certified email. After that, nobody could even look at my mother. My name is Natalie Bennett. I am 32 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have made a living out of untangling other people's disasters. As a patient advocate at the Harbor Glen Family Resource Center, my daily routine involves sitting in sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms, mediating between exhausted, terrified families and an equally exhausted healthcare system. I have been trained, rigorously and exhaustively, to read the micro-expressions in a crowded room. I know how to anticipate the collapse of a conversation before the first angry word is spoken, and I know how to de-escalate panic using nothing but the steady, measured cadence of my voice. I am a professional at maintaining boundaries in the face of emotional chaos. But none of that professional armor, none of those hard-won clinical skills, could have prepared me for the sheer, suffocating dread of sitting in the driveway of my childhood home on Thanksgiving night. I kept my sedan idling for a long time, letting the heater blast dry, stale air against my numb fingers. Outside, the harsh November wind whipped through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the streets of this quiet, affluent Pennsylvania suburb. The houses around me were picture-perfect monuments to American holidays, glowing with warm porch lights and festive wreaths. My parents' home, a sprawling two-story colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac, looked exactly as it had for 30 years, yet, looking at it through the windshield, it felt fundamentally wrong. Through the half-drawn curtains of the large bay window, the amber glow of the living room lamps spilled out onto the frost-covered lawn. On any normal holiday, this window framed a static, predictable portrait of domestic life, people sitting, drinking, watching television. Tonight, however, the silhouettes shifting behind the sheer cream-colored fabric were dense, frantic, and restless. There were too many shadows moving back and forth, pacing the length of the room rather than mingling in small groups. They were not lingering by the television to watch the football game. They were not waiting for the turkey to finish roasting. They were waiting for me. To fully grasp the gravity of that realization, you have to understand the architect of our family dynamics, my mother, Elaine Bennett. In her domain, Thanksgiving is not a holiday meant for relaxation or gratitude. It is a highly choreographed theatrical production, and my mother is the tyrannical director. Every single element of the day is ruthlessly scripted long before the first guest arrives. The seating chart at the long dining table is fixed, subtly dictated by who is currently in favor and who needs to be quietly punished. The pre-dinner prayer is drafted weeks in advance to hit specific moral talking points. Even the casual living room conversations are monitored and corralled by her to ensure no one outshines her or accidentally brings up uncomfortable family realities. Spontaneity is not just discouraged, it is treated as a direct personal insult to Elaine. So any change to how the room looks, any disruption to her staging, is never an accident. I finally turned off the ignition. The sudden silence inside the car amplified the heavy, rapid thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I grabbed my purse, took a deep breath of the sharp, freezing air, and stepped out. My boots crunched loudly against the thin, brittle layer of ice coating the paved walkway. The moment I pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped into the familiar foyer, the air inside felt dense, almost solid. It was laced with the rich, heavy smells of roasted sage, browned butter, and baking apples. But beneath the culinary warmth lay an undeniable, electric undercurrent of tension. I unspooled my woolen scarf from my neck, my eyes immediately drifting past the hallway and into the living room. I froze, one arm halfway out of my winter coat. The heavy mahogany coffee table, which had anchored the center of that room since I was a child, had been shoved unceremoniously against the far wall, pushing up against the baseboards. In its place, the two floral armchairs, my father's leather recliner, the love seat, and several rigid metal folding chairs brought up from the basement had been arranged into a wide, deliberate circle. It looked exactly like the group therapy setups I arranged every Tuesday at Harbor Glen, or worse, the staging ground for a hostile intervention. In my mother's house, you absolutely did not rearrange the heavy furniture before the dessert plates were cleared, unless a major decree was about to be handed down. It was a spatial layout explicitly designed for an audience, and for an accused to sit in the center. I forced my legs to move, carrying my coat down the hallway toward the kitchen. The low, murmuring hum of chatter that had been drifting through the house abruptly died the second my boots crossed the kitchen threshold. It was as if someone had pulled the plug. Relatives I had known my entire life suddenly found the grout lines on the tile floor or the bottom rims of their wine glasses utterly fascinating. Uncle Richard coughed loudly and took a deliberate step backward, avoiding my gaze entirely. Aunt Susan practically spun around on her heels to face the double ovens, aggressively inspecting a casserole that was already done. Only my older sister, Brooke, attempted to bridge the terrifying, echoing silence. She stood rigid by the kitchen island, meticulously laying out the silver dessert forks on a folded linen napkin. Brooke had always been the golden child, the one who effortlessly played by Elaine's complex rules, but tonight, her perfect facade was cracking under the pressure. I watched her hands. They were trembling so violently that the silver tines of the forks clinked sharply against one another. A frantic, metallic rhythm that betrayed the wide, forced smile she plastered across her face. "You made it," Brooke whispered, her voice tight and breathy, her eyes darting nervously over my shoulder toward the dining room archway. Before I could even formulate a reply, the hardwood floorboards creaked. Elaine Bennett appeared in the doorway, a vision of suburban matriarchy in an immaculate burgundy cashmere sweater and a single strand of pearls. Her gaze swept over me, calculating, sharp, and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. The entire kitchen seemed to hold its collective breath. "Well," my mother announced, her voice projecting with practiced resonance, just loud enough to ensure every single person hiding in the adjacent rooms could hear her perfectly. "Look who finally decided to join us. I am so glad you could remember the way home this time. Natalie. We were beginning to think you had gotten lost in your own busy little world." It was a classic Elaine opener, a precise micro-humiliation served with a polite smile, designed to immediately establish her dominance and my inadequacy in front of an audience. I did not take the bait. I simply gave a tight nod, murmured a generic, polite greeting to the room, and walked past her to take my assigned seat at the long, polished dining table. The meal that followed was an exercise in psychological endurance. The turkey tasted like ash in my mouth. The conversation was painfully stilted, consisting exclusively of hollow remarks about the impending winter weather and exaggerated, repetitive compliments about the texture of the dry stuffing. The only sounds that seemed real were the scraping of knives against china and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. But my attention was entirely captivated by my mother's right hand. Elaine was wearing a long, thick, cream-colored cardigan draped over her burgundy sweater. Tucked deep into the right pocket was a thick, sharply folded stack of crisp papers. It was far too bulky to be a recipe card, and too stiff to be a tissue. Throughout the agonizingly slow 45 minutes of dinner, her fingers constantly drifted downward to trace the sharp edge of that folded stack. She touched it with a reverent, almost possessive rhythm. She patted it the way a soldier subtly checks a concealed weapon before walking into a deliberate ambush. Every single time her fingers brushed against that pocket, a specific text message flashed brightly in my mind, urgent and terrifying. Exactly 2 hours before I had left my apartment to drive here, my younger cousin Leah Mercer had sent me a message. Leah was the quiet, invisible observer of the extended family, the one who saw everything but rarely dared to speak. Her text had been brief, sent without any punctuation, and deeply chilling. "If you still come tonight, do not leave halfway through, no matter what she says to you. They want you to walk out so you do not have to hear the rest of it." I slowly looked around the dining table. I saw my father staring blankly at his half-eaten plate, choosing his familiar, cowardly sanctuary of silence. I saw Brooke chewing obsessively on her lower lip, her eyes wide with a sickening mixture of guilt and dark anticipation. I looked through the archway and saw the empty, waiting circle of chairs sitting ominously in the living room. Finally, I looked at my mother. Her hand was resting firmly on the papers in her pocket, and she was watching me with the serene, unblinking confidence of a predator whose trap had already been perfectly sprung. The heavy, suffocating feeling in my chest finally solidified into cold, hard certainty. This was not a family Thanksgiving dinner. The roasted bird, the cranberry sauce, the forced, polite smiles, they were all just elaborate set dressing. I was not a welcomed guest returning to my childhood home. I was the defendant, and this night was a carefully orchestrated, brutal sentencing, prepared entirely in my absence, waiting only for my arrival to commence. I have occupied the exact same two-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city for 6 consecutive years, every single month, on the first day of the month. My rent is paid in full from an account I manage entirely on my own. I have built a stable career. I pay my own health insurance premiums. I buy my own groceries. And I do not ask anyone for a single dime. That is the factual reality of my existence. Yet, if you were to ask any relative currently chewing their food in this suffocating dining room to summarize my life, you would receive a completely different biography. In the collective mind of the Bennett family, I am forever frozen as the chaotic, emotional liability. I am the daughter who simply cannot be trusted with a bank account or a major life decision. This alternate reality is entirely the handiwork of Elaine. My mother possesses a truly terrifying talent for rewriting my history in real time. She does not do it with screaming matches. She does it with a gentle, long-suffering sigh over a cup of afternoon tea. She curates the narrative of my failures and broadcasts them with the practiced ease of a primetime news anchor. If I decide to change departments at work for better pay, Elaine tells Aunt Susan that I'm struggling to hold down a job. If I choose to spend a weekend alone reading instead of attending a loud neighborhood block party, she confides in Uncle Richard that I am isolating myself and acting erratic again. Her favorite phrases to describe me are always perfectly weaponized. I am always borrowing. I am always quitting. I am always in desperate need of a rescue that only the family can provide. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of it all is that when a genuine crisis hits this family, Elaine is never the one rolling up her sleeves. Because of my background in patient advocacy, I am the one who actually understands how the world works when things fall apart. 3 years ago, when Great Aunt Martha needed a complicated double bypass surgery, I was the one who sat in that freezing surgical waiting room for 14 straight hours. I drank terrible vending machine coffee and translated the surgeon's rapid-fire medical jargon into terms the family could understand. When my cousin Greg was unfairly denied his disability benefits, I spent exactly 3 weeks of my lunch hours fighting with insurance adjusters on the telephone until the decision was overturned. I drove my grandmother to her weekly physical therapy sessions for 8 solid months without ever asking for gas money. But in the bizarre accounting system of my family, none of those hours or efforts hold any value. Sweating through an insurance appeal does not buy you respect, because I did not write a massive check or host a catered dinner party to brag about my contributions. My work was entirely invisible. To them, my willingness to help was just further proof that I was overly emotional, getting far too involved in other people's misery because I had no real life of my own. My father, Thomas, has always known the truth. He watches me do the heavy lifting, and he hears my mother spin her lies. But my father is a man who treats silence as a survival strategy. He is not a cruel man by nature, but his passivity makes him fully complicit. Whenever Elaine starts sharpening her verbal knives and aiming them at my back, Thomas suddenly finds the pattern on his dinner plate completely fascinating. He will inspect a single green bean as if it holds the secrets of the universe. If the emotional temperature in the room rises even a fraction of a degree, he will abruptly stand up, loudly announce that the recycling bins need to be taken to the curb immediately, and disappear out the back door. He chooses the chill of the driveway over the heat of defending his youngest daughter, And then there is Brooke. Looking at my older sister across the table, watching her aggressively cut her turkey into tiny, perfect squares, you would think she was the pinnacle of independent adulthood. Brooke is the golden child, the masterpiece Elaine always wanted to mold. She married a corporate lawyer at the age of 25. She lives in a pristine, custom-built house in the most expensive zip code in the county, and she works at a high-end interior design firm where her main responsibility is selecting expensive linen fabrics. Brooke knows how to speak in modulated tones, how to wear neutral colors, and how to never, ever challenge our mother's authority. But the deeply hidden truth, the secret that would shatter the family illusion, is that Brooke is entirely incapable of functioning without Elaine. She calls our mother 4 times a day for emotional regulation. She cannot decide which brand of organic milk to buy without seeking Elaine's approval. She is tethered to our mother by a thick, invisible rope of anxiety, terrified of making a single unauthorized choice. I am the one who lives completely independently, fighting my own battles. But Brooke is the one universally celebrated as the successful, stable adult. I knew exactly what the script for this evening was supposed to be, because I had endured it every Thanksgiving for the past decade. Right around the time the gravy boat made its second lap around the table, Elaine would deploy her signature move. She would slip a perfectly calibrated micro-humiliation into the casual conversation, aiming right for my finances, my romantic life, or my career. 5 years ago, it was a loud, pitying comment about how brave I was to drive such an old car in the winter. 3 years ago, it was a sudden, public prayer for me to finally find a husband who could provide me with a real safety net. The insults were always small. Surgical cuts. They never caused enough visible bleeding to justify a screaming match. But over 20 years, they leave you utterly drained of blood. If you are wondering why an entire room full of adults simply nods along to Elaine's fabricated stories, the answer is frustratingly simple. They side with her not because they are inherently malicious, but because Elaine understands the power of being the first to speak. She gets to the microphone before anyone else even knows there is a stage. She tells her version of events with a steady, authoritative voice, packing her lies with just enough mundane details to make them sound like indisputable facts. When a matriarch tells you a story with absolute, unshakable certainty, human nature dictates that you believe her. The only person who has ever seen through the cracks is my younger cousin, Leah. Sitting 2 chairs down from me tonight, Leah kept her eyes fixed firmly on her water glass. She is the quiet observer, the one who notices when Elaine's timelines do not quite make sense. For years, Leah has known that the family narrative about me is deeply flawed, but she has always been too terrified of becoming Elaine's next target to speak up. She has the sight, but she has never had the proof. That is why her warning text message to me earlier tonight was an act of profound, desperate bravery. As dinner dragged on, I felt the familiar burning prickle of defensive rage starting to gather in my chest. For years, my default reaction had been to fight back. I would raise my voice. I would present logical arguments. I would try to desperately defend my character right there over the mashed potatoes. And every single time, I played right into my mother's hands. An angry reaction was exactly what she wanted. It allowed her to look at the rest of the family with wide, innocent eyes, as if to say, "Look at poor, unstable Natalie losing her mind over a simple question." But tonight was different. Tonight, the stakes were entirely shifted. I looked across the table at Elaine, watching her fingers gently stroke the folded papers hidden in her cardigan pocket. I took a slow, deep breath. Forcing my heart rate to steady, I made a silent, ironclad promise to myself. I would not give her a single emotional reaction. I would not raise my voice. I would not cry. And I would not defend myself against her petty bait. No matter how hard she pushed, no matter what trap she was preparing to spring in that circle of chairs in the living room, I was going to remain perfectly, terrifyingly calm. I was going to let her dig her own grave, and I was going to stand by silently until it was time to hand her the shovel. The roots of the invisible snare waiting for me in the living room were actually planted exactly 24 months ago. That was the year my maternal grandmother, June Whitaker, finally succumbed to a cascading series of respiratory failures. Her passing was not sudden. It was an agonizingly slow, deeply undignified decline that required round-the-clock monitoring. For the last 18 months of her life, the ambient noise of our family gatherings was entirely dominated by anxious, hushed conversations about the terrifying mathematics of elderly care. Relatives exchanged grim looks over coffee, trading horror stories about daily room rates at the skilled nursing facility and the exorbitant cost of specialized medical equipment. When Grandma June finally drew her last breath, there was absolutely no debate among the relatives regarding who would manage the chaotic aftermath. My mother was universally and immediately designated as the personal representative of the estate. To the outside observer, it made perfect, logical sense. She had always been the undisputed champion of bureaucratic warfare within our bloodline. She thrived on categorizing receipts, arguing with insurance adjusters, and wielding the rigid authority of legal paperwork. Handing her the keys to the estate felt like the safest possible option for a grieving family. Roughly 6 weeks after we buried my grandmother, my mother convened a casual Sunday meeting right here at this dining table. She arrived armed with thick, heavily tabbed manila folders and delivered her final financial verdict. According to her meticulous, seemingly bulletproof accounting, nearly all the proceeds from the liquidation of Grandma June's modest 2-bedroom house had completely vanished. She spoke with a rehearsed, heavy sigh, explaining that the money had been entirely consumed by a mountain of outstanding medical debts. A sudden and massive emergency roof repair required, just to make the property sellable, and a significant deduction for the financial support Natalie had supposedly required over the years. I sat in my chair, utterly paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. I had never asked for, nor received, a single dime from my grandmother's accounts to fund my life. Yet, my mother delivered this fabricated line item with such smooth, tragic resignation that the aunts and uncles simply nodded in sympathetic agreement. The room absorbed her fiction as absolute, unshakable fact. I felt a sharp, suffocating flare of indignation burning in my throat. But I had absolutely zero access to the banking records or the ledger. I could not prove a negative. I only possessed a faded, warm memory from 5 years prior, of Grandma June holding my hand on the porch and whispering vaguely about leaving a little something behind to help her granddaughters establish their independence. Lacking any tangible proof to challenge the executor of the estate, I swallowed my bitter anger and let the matter drop into the unspoken family archive. Fast forward 8 months later. I had spent 4 solid years living on a remarkably tight budget, saving every spare dollar I earned. I finally had enough capital accumulated for a 20% down payment on a small, practical townhouse located relatively close to my office. It was a modest place, but it represented total, undeniable autonomy. I submitted my mortgage application with a rare, soaring sense of genuine pride. 3 days later, the senior loan officer called my cell phone. His tone was awkward, laced with the polite, practiced pity reserved for deeply irresponsible clients. He informed me that my application had been unequivocally denied. He patiently explained that my debt-to-income ratio was catastrophically high. I actually laughed out loud, assuming the bank had simply crossed my file with someone else's. I confidently told him I owned a 5-year-old sedan and carried absolutely zero credit card debt. He gently corrected me, stating that my official credit report showed a massive, active home equity line of credit. It was a staggering financial obligation, tied to a property deed I had never seen, much less signed for. I left work early, rushed back to my apartment, and pulled my full, detailed credit history. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely type my own social security number into the keyboard. There it was, printed in stark black and white. A 6-figure line of credit was attached directly to my name. I spent the next 48 hours navigating a maddening labyrinth of automated banking menus until I finally badgered a customer service representative into emailing me the origination documents. When the PDF file loaded on my monitor, the blood roared in my ears. The loan application featured a verified electronic signature matching my exact legal name. But what made the walls of my apartment spin was the contact information listed on the security protocol. The verification codes and digital paperwork had not been sent to my current professional email address. They had been routed through an old, embarrassing email account I had created when I was 15. The only people on earth who possessed the knowledge of that old address, and the predictable childhood pet name used as its password, lived under my parents' roof. I drove straight to the suburbs. My father was working a late shift, leaving just my mother and me in the kitchen. I slammed the printed bank documents onto the granite island. I demanded to know why a massive loan had been taken out in my name against an asset that sounded suspiciously like the equity of Grandma June's estate before the house was formally sold. My mother did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not drop her coffee mug. And she certainly did not feign ignorance. Her reaction was terrifyingly swift and completely devoid of any recognizable human guilt. She smoothly gathered the scattered papers, squared the edges against the counter, and looked me dead in the eye. She told me, her voice dropping to a harsh, lecturing whisper, that it was merely a temporary administrative procedure necessary to protect the family assets during a complex estate transition. She acted as if I had stumbled into an adult conversation I was simply too foolish to comprehend. When I used the words identity theft, her eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. She leaned in close, invading my physical space, and delivered her ultimatum. She promised me that if I dared to make a fuss, if I contacted the bank investigators or brought lawyers into her house, she would ensure the entire extended family knew exactly how ungrateful and greedy I truly was. She told me I would destroy the family over a simple paperwork technicality. I left her kitchen in tears, paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the betrayal. But Elaine did not waste a single minute resting on her victory. While I was sitting alone in my apartment trying to comprehend the legal nightmare I was in, she was systematically working the telephones. By the end of that week, the poison had been thoroughly injected into the family bloodstream. Without ever once mentioning the secret, fraudulent loan, my mother began planting strategic seeds of sorrow with every aunt and uncle who would listen. She told them I was ruthlessly demanding a massive, unearned cut of the estate, despite never helping change Grandma June's oxygen tanks. She whispered that I was threatening to drag my own grieving mother into court for a cash payout. She systematically painted me as a money-hungry, litigious monster before I had even formulated a coherent plan to defend myself. That was the exact moment the dynamic of my entire life fundamentally fractured. For 3 decades, my mother's manipulations had been confined to cruel words, emotional gaslighting, and the slow, deliberate isolation of my character. I had learned how to absorb those psychological blows. But staring at a fraudulent banking document bearing my forged digital signature, the reality of my situation crystallized into something sharp, cold, and incredibly dangerous. This was no longer just about toxic family gossip or Thanksgiving dinner insults. This was a tangible, ruinous financial crime. My own identity had been weaponized to steal money, and I was being held hostage by the threat of losing a family that was already being turned against me. The trap in the living room tonight was not built with words. It was built with stolen equity. I did not storm back into that house and demand a screaming match. At the Harbor Glen Family Resource Center, screaming matches are exactly what people do when they have absolutely no leverage left. My entire professional life consists of untangling massive bureaucratic knots, tracking down maliciously denied insurance claims, and forcing giant, indifferent healthcare systems to admit their clerical errors. I know intimately how paper trails work. I know that in any conflict, whoever holds the most meticulously documented, chronologically sound timeline wins the war. So, I took all the cold, suffocating panic my mother had handed me in that kitchen and funneled it directly into a 3-ring binder. First, I initiated a formal, multi-agency dispute. I requested a comprehensive, certified copy of my credit profile from all 3 major reporting bureaus, followed immediately by a formal debt verification letter sent via certified mail with a return receipt requested. I needed the financial institution to legally prove I owed them the balance. When the official documentation finally arrived in a thick, rigid envelope, the pieces of the puzzle locked into place with a sickening, heavy snap. The home equity line of credit was not just a random, unsecured personal loan. It was explicitly tied to the exact physical address of Grandma June's property, originated mere weeks before the house was officially listed on the market and sold. I realized quickly that I needed someone who understood the lethal, hidden intricacies of estate fraud, someone completely detached from my family's immense emotional gravity. I pulled from my savings and paid a hefty retainer for 3 solid hours of consultation with an estate litigation attorney named Carmen Ives. Carmen was a formidable woman who spoke in sharp, declarative sentences and viewed family drama exclusively through the cold, unfeeling lens of legal liability. Sitting in her austere, glass-walled office, I laid out the bank documents, the county property records, and the timeline of my grandmother's death. Carmen looked over the paperwork in total silence for 10 minutes, tapped her heavy silver pen against the mahogany desk, and gave me the most important piece of advice of my entire life. She told me to absolutely cease all direct communication with my mother regarding the money. Confrontation without leverage, she explained, only gives the opposition valuable time to destroy evidence, alter their strategy, or muddy the waters. We needed to quietly build an impenetrable fortress of certified proof before we ever let her know we were actively investigating her actions. Under Carmen's aggressive legal direction, we filed a formal demand for records with Pine Ridge Community Bank, the local regional institution holding the fraudulent note. We did not ask for polite customer service summaries. We legally compelled their compliance department to produce the raw, unedited back-end data. We demanded the electronic signature audit trail, the device identifiers, the IP addresses of every login session, and the name of the internal loan officer who manually pushed the file through the underwriting process. While we waited for the bank's legal department to comply, the silence from my family was deafening. But then, a vital crack appeared in my mother's armor. It came in the form of an encrypted, secure message from my cousin Leah. Leah did not include any text, just a single, slightly blurry photograph taken hastily inside my parents' kitchen. It was a shot of my mother's monogrammed leather notebook, left open on the granite island counter. Written in Elaine's unmistakable, sharp cursive was a bulleted list of tasks. The third line down read, Thanksgiving, settle the issue, get consensus, no more claims. My stomach dropped completely. She was not just going to sweep this under the rug and hope I forgot about it. She was actively scripting a grand finale. She was going to use the holiday dinner as a theatrical stage to finalize whatever theft she had orchestrated, using the extended family as a captive jury to enforce her ruling. That notebook entry sent me racing back to my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to know exactly how she had bypassed the digital security. I spent 4 agonizing hours locked out of my old, dormant email account, answering ridiculous security questions I had set in high school until I finally triggered a hard password reset. When the inbox loaded, it was a massive graveyard of spam and expired retail coupons. But buried in a folder labeled as updates from 2 years ago, I found it. It was an unopened notification thread from a secure digital document signing service. I looked closely at the exact timestamp on the final, supposedly verified signature. It was logged at 14 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in late October. I immediately pulled up my old payroll records and employee timesheets from the clinic. On that specific Tuesday, at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, I was not sitting at a computer authorizing a massive financial lien. I was standing in the middle of a brightly lit hospital emergency room, physically signing a patient intake form alongside an entire team of triage nurses while managing a psychiatric hold for a distraught teenager. I had a rock-solid, federally documented alibi involving multiple medical professionals, hospital security cameras, and physical badge swipes. I could categorically prove I was nowhere near a keyboard when that document was legally executed. Then, Carmen called me with the official records from Pine Ridge Community Bank. The bank had surrendered the electronic audit trail. The data revealed a tiny, catastrophic technical mistake my mother had made. When you sign a legal document electronically, the software silently logs the unique Internet Protocol address of the network you are connected to. The address stamped on the loan origination file did not match the router in my apartment. It did not match the hospital's secure network. It perfectly matched the Internet Service Provider account registered to my parents' suburban address. The digital footprint led straight back to the living room I had grown up in. Carmen and I sat in her office, looking at the undeniable, legally binding proof of a federal felony. The strategy my mother was constructing for Thanksgiving suddenly became terrifyingly clear. She had forged the loan to siphon the equity out of the estate before the liquidation. Now, 2 years later, she knew the statute of limitations on challenging an estate was ticking down, and she knew I was starting to ask dangerous questions. She was going to use the fabricated debt as leverage. She was going to stand in front of the entire family, accuse me of secretly taking the money, and generously offer to forgive my supposed debt to the family, but only if I signed a legally binding release waiving my right to any future claims against Grandma June's estate. She was going to make me sign away my rights in order to be absolved of a crime she committed. Carmen asked if I wanted to have her served with a lawsuit immediately, effectively blowing up the holiday before the turkey was even carved. I looked at the printed photograph of the notebook Leah had sent. I thought about the decades of subtle humiliation, the way my mother had perfectly trained the entire family to view me as unstable and untrustworthy. If I sued her quietly through the courts, she would just spin it to the family as another example of my unhinged, litigious nature. She would play the wounded victim, and they would all believe her. I realized that winning in a sterile courtroom would never be enough to clear my name. I needed to dismantle her power in the exact arena where she had built it. I needed the audience she was so meticulously preparing. I told Carmen to draft everything, to put the bank logs, the hospital timesheets, and the Internet Protocol traces into a single, undeniable dossier. I was going to attend Thanksgiving. I was not going to go there to argue, or to beg for the family to believe me. I was going to walk directly into her trap, sit in the center of her little theater, and let her present her entire fabricated case to the jury. I would let her speak until she had completely committed to the lie in front of every single aunt, uncle, and cousin, and then I was going to burn her kingdom to the ground with her own paperwork. 7 days before the Thursday of the holiday, the invisible machinery of my family began to grind with a terrifying, silent efficiency. It started with a subtle shift in my phone notifications. In our insulated, suffocating small town, toxic gossip never travels in a straight, honest line. It seeps through the floorboards and infects every casual interaction. Elaine did not send a mass email outlining her grievances. That would leave a digital trail, and my mother was far too calculating for that. Instead, she initiated a relentless, highly coordinated telephone campaign, calling each aunt, uncle, and second cousin individually. I knew the campaign had launched because the tone of my incoming messages shifted dramatically over a period of 48 hours. People who usually sent me frivolous pictures of their pets were suddenly sending me somber, heavy messages about the paramount importance of family unity. My mother's script for these calls was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She never used dangerous, actionable words like fraud, forgery, or equity. Instead, she leaned entirely into the vocabulary of a weary, heartbroken martyr. She told her siblings and in-laws that she was completely physically and mentally exhausted. She claimed she had carried the heavy burden of the family for far too long, and that she only wanted one single, peaceful holiday. But she would sigh tragically into the receiver. Her youngest daughter was threatening to drag the entire bloodline into a cold, public courtroom. By framing my completely justified investigation into my own stolen identity as a malicious, unprovoked attack on the family's peace, she effectively transformed a severe financial crime into a question of my morality. She made it an issue of my supposed lack of filial piety. The relatives ate it up. They always preferred a comfortable lie about my instability over an uncomfortable truth about my mother's cruelty. Brooke, predictably, was deployed as the soft-spoken, diplomatic emissary. 3 days before the dinner, my phone buzzed with a long, rambling text message from my older sister. She wrote that she knew I was upset about some minor paperwork misunderstandings regarding the estate, but she begged me not to make a massive scene during the holiday gathering. She typed out a long paragraph explaining that our mother was losing sleep. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and that we all just needed to swallow our pride and drop our grievances for the sake of the family. Brooke was not actually asking for the truth to be revealed. She was begging for my immediate compliance simply to keep her own perfectly curated world comfortable. I replied with a single, neutral word acknowledging I had read the message, knowing my lack of emotional response would only make her frantic. My father, meanwhile, remained comfortably hidden in his fortress of plausible deniability. Through a highly encrypted message from Leah, I learned that Thomas had walked into the home office on Monday evening and found Elaine meticulously organizing a thick stack of legal documents. He had stood in the doorway and overheard her on the telephone with a local notary public, explicitly discussing the legal requirements for a binding release of claims document. He knew perfectly well that a standard Thanksgiving dinner did not require notarized waivers. Yet, rather than asking his wife what kind of legal trap she was plotting against his youngest daughter, he simply turned around, walked out to the garage, and spent 3 hours aggressively organizing his tool bench. His deliberate silence was the exact permission she needed to proceed. The true, horrifying scope of my mother's fabricated narrative did not fully register with me until Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at the Resource Center, reviewing a patient file, when my cell phone rang. It was my great-aunt Helen. She sounded confused and slightly breathless, completely characteristic of her advanced age. She chit-chatted about the impending winter weather for exactly 2 minutes before dropping a massive, suffocating anvil onto my chest. She asked me, in a tone of gentle, grandmotherly concern, when I planned to finally pay back the large sum of money my mother had advanced me from the estate fund. She added, her voice dipping into mild disappointment, that it was incredibly ungrateful of me to demand an inheritance after my mother had practically bankrupted herself to help me pay off my imaginary debts. I felt the blood drain completely from my face, leaving my skin icy and numb. I managed to politely excuse myself from the telephone call without screaming, my professional training barely keeping my voice steady. I hung up and stared blindly at the gray fabric wall of my cubicle. The lie was no longer just a vague rumor about my bad attitude. It was highly specific. It was financially weaponized, and it was universally accepted by the extended family as the absolute, indisputable truth. Elaine was not merely trying to ruin my reputation through town gossip. She was actively staging a public, irreversible execution of my character. She wanted to gather the entire bloodline in one room, present her fabricated ledger of my supposed debts, and use the crushing weight of their collective judgment to force me to sign that release document. She wanted to seal the false story into the family history permanently, legally blocking me from ever challenging the fraudulent line of credit without looking like a monster who was reneging on a family agreement. Leah confirmed my terrifying theory later that same evening. She sent a rapid series of messages detailing the physical preparations happening at the house. The traditional seating chart had been completely scrapped. The folding chairs were being hauled up from the basement. The children were going to be fed early and banished to the finished basement with movies to keep them out of earshot. The main living room was being cleared out entirely to create a wide, inescapable arena designed specifically for a serious family discussion. The trap was fully constructed, and the steel jaws were locked open, waiting patiently for me to step inside. On Wednesday morning, less than 30 hours before I was scheduled to walk through my parents' front door, I sat in Carmen Ives's sleek, aggressively air-conditioned downtown office. Resting dead center on her polished mahogany desk was a thick, pristine manila envelope. Inside that envelope was a fully drafted civil complaint, detailing every single count of identity theft, forged signatures, and financial fraud, along with an emergency motion for a judge to legally freeze every single asset tied to my grandmother's estate. Carmen looked at me intently over the rim of her expensive glasses. She told me, her voice devoid of any emotion, that all I had to do was give her the verbal green light. She promised she would have a ruthless process server knock loudly on my mother's front door before the turkey even went into the oven on Thursday morning. It would completely detonate the holiday, but it would legally protect my assets and keep me perfectly safe from whatever kangaroo court my mother was assembling. I looked down at the crisp white paper of the lawsuit protruding from the envelope. If I let Carmen file it right then, my mother would immediately spin the narrative. She would stand in her kitchen on Thursday afternoon, crying genuine, rehearsed tears, holding up the legal summons as the ultimate, undeniable proof of my cruelty. The family would instinctively rally around her, completely convinced that I was a greedy, vindictive child attacking a grieving widow. The dense, factual truth buried in those legal filings would never penetrate their blind, conditioned loyalty. I realized, with a sense of cold, terrifying clarity, that the only way to destroy a massive public lie is with a devastatingly public execution of that exact lie. I looked back up at my attorney and shook my head. I told her to hold the filing in her desk. I told her I was going to let my mother have her grand theatrical family vote. I was going to let her stand in front of everyone and commit entirely, irreversibly to her fiction. I would endure the absolute worst psychological pressure she could throw at me, and then, right there in the center of her carefully constructed arena, I was going to turn the blinding lights of the truth onto her. The 72 hours leading up to that Thursday evening were a masterclass in psychological torture. Sleep completely abandoned me. I spent 3 consecutive nights staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, listening to the relentless hum of the refrigerator, while a toxic, insidious doubt began to take root in my own mind. That is the true, devastating power of someone who has gaslit you for your entire existence. When a fabricated story is repeated often enough, with enough unwavering conviction, your own memory begins to buckle under the pressure. I found myself lying in the dark, actually trying to calculate if there was some forgotten stretch of months in my early 20s where I somehow drained my family's finances without realizing it. I questioned my own sanity. I wondered if maybe I truly was the unreliable, chaotic narrator of my own life that Elaine claimed I was. This mental erosion was not a new phenomenon. It was the accumulated, crushing weight of 2 decades of surrender. I lay in bed and traced the history of my own cowardice, remembering all the previous holidays, birthdays, and casual Sunday dinners where I had swallowed my pride just to keep the fragile peace. I remembered nodding along to minor insults. I remembered apologizing for arguments I did not start, simply to stop the oppressive, icy silence my mother would strategically enforce. What I had failed to understand back then was that in Elaine's ecosystem, every single time I chose silence to preserve the atmosphere, she instantly categorized that silence as a full admission of guilt. My quiet retreats were the very building blocks she used to construct her elaborate, fictional monument of my incompetence. The bitter irony of my situation peaked during my daytime hours at the Harbor Glen Family Resource Center. On Tuesday morning, I sat in a brightly lit consultation room with a young, exhausted mother who was being emotionally bullied by her ex-husband over medical decisions for their child. I looked her directly in the eyes, my voice steady and completely authoritative, and I taught her exactly how to establish an unbreachable boundary. I gave her the precise vocabulary to reject manipulation. I was a fierce, uncompromising advocate for a complete stranger, but the moment I retreated to the privacy of my own cubicle, the professional mask dissolved. I stared at my computer screen, feeling entirely hollowed out, nauseated by the hypocrisy of my own existence. I was a professional at building armor for everyone else, yet I was walking around completely exposed, bleeding out from wounds inflicted by my own mother. I confessed this overwhelming urge to surrender to Carmen Ives during a brief, midday telephone call. My voice was thick and trembling, betraying the severe exhaustion I was trying so hard to hide. I told my lawyer that I was dangerously close to simply calling my parents, claiming I had contracted a severe stomach flu, and hiding in my apartment until January. Carmen did not offer me warm, maternal comfort. Instead, She offered me the cold, bracing splash of clinical reality. She told me that the overwhelming desire to flee was the textbook, physiological response of a long-term gaslighting victim facing their abuser. She instructed me, in a tone that brokered absolutely no argument, to detach entirely from my emotions. Feelings, she warned, would betray me the second my mother raised her voice. The only thing that would not flinch, the only thing that did not possess a nervous system, was the paper. She told me to anchor my entire soul to the physical documents. Her advice became absolutely critical on Wednesday evening, when Leah managed to transmit another piece of covert intelligence. It was not a blurry photograph this time. It was a scanned, perfectly legible copy of a document she had found sitting directly on top of the household printer. Elaine had titled it, in bold, capitalized letters, "A Family Resolution." I read the text on the glowing screen, my blood turning to ice. It was a formal, pseudo-legal declaration, written in my mother's voice, but designed with blank lines at the bottom to be signed by everyone in attendance. It explicitly demanded that I be formally barred from all future family gatherings and mandated that I immediately drop any and all financial claims against the estate of June Whitaker, in exchange for the family generously forgiving my fabricated debts. It was a literal excommunication decree, printed on heavy stock paper, waiting for a public execution. The psychological siege culminated just 4 hours before I was supposed to leave for the dinner. My cell phone rang, displaying Brooke's name. I answered, and immediately, the sound of her jagged, wet sobbing filled my ear. Brooke was completely falling apart under the tension. She did not ask me how I was doing. She did not ask me for my side of the story. She simply launched into a frantic, breathless lecture, using the exact cadence and vocabulary of our mother. She cried that I was destroying the only family we had left. She told me that if I walked into that house and blew up the holiday, the resulting wreckage would be entirely my fault. She pleaded with me to just apologize to our mother, to just sign whatever she needed, so we could all go back to normal. Brooke was not speaking as my sister. She was acting as the final, desperate extension of my mother's will, a human shield thrown in my path to ensure I complied. When Brooke finally hung up, the silence in my apartment was crushing. I stood in my small entryway, looking at my winter coat hanging on the hook. My hands were shaking so severely I could barely feel my fingertips. The pressure was simply too immense. The idea of walking into a room filled with 24 people who had already convicted me, people who were armed with a printed resolution to banish me, felt like walking voluntarily into a blazing furnace. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my car keys, and dropped them onto the entryway console table. The metallic clatter sounded like a final, definitive surrender. I decided I was not going. I decided I would let them have their lie. It was easier to be the villain in their story than to face the firing squad. I turned around to walk into the kitchen, entirely ready to pour a glass of water and turn off my phone. But as I turned, my eyes caught the edge of the thick, gray folder sitting on my dining table. It was the master dossier Carmen and I had compiled. Peeking out from the edge of the folder was the top corner of the bank origination file. I could clearly see my own first and last name, printed in stark black ink, right above a fraudulent digital signature line. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I looked at that forged name. That was not a misunderstanding. That was not a simple family disagreement. That was a theft of my autonomy. If I stayed home, that forged signature became the permanent, uncontested truth. I walked back to the table, my shaking hands suddenly completely still. I opened the folder. I realized I could not just bring one master copy. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously assembling individual packets. I counted the exact number of adult relatives who would be sitting in that living room. I prepared one thick manila envelope for every single one of them. I was not going to rely on a digital presentation or a single piece of paper that my mother could simply snatch out of my hands and destroy. Inside each envelope, I placed a single bullet-pointed summary page outlining the exact chronological sequence of the fraud. Behind that summary, I attached the certified bank audit logs. The network location data matching my parents' house, and the hospital timesheets proving I was managing a psychiatric hold miles away from a computer when the loan was finalized. I made the evidence completely decentralized and indestructible. Even if my mother screamed, even if she ordered me out of the house, I would leave the envelopes behind. Once a room full of people has physical proof in their own hands, the narrative can never be contained or controlled by one person ever again. I finished sealing the final envelope. I stacked them neatly into a canvas tote bag. I walked back to the entryway, picked up my car keys, and looked at my reflection in the small mirror hanging by the door. My face was pale, and my eyes were rimmed with red, but the debilitating, suffocating terror had burned away, leaving behind something cold, heavy, and incredibly hard. I looked at myself and spoke the words aloud, letting them solidify in the empty apartment. I am not going there to be believed. I am going there to ensure the truth is heard. The final, devastating pieces of the puzzle arrived from Pine Ridge Community Bank just hours before I began sealing the manila envelopes in my apartment. While my attorney and I had already tracked the digital footprint of the loan application back to my parents' internet router, the newly delivered compliance package contained the raw mechanical anatomy of the fraud. It was no longer just a suspicion of who pressed the button. It was a legally certified, step-by-step manual of how my mother had stolen my financial identity. The security protocol for a high-value credit line required a two-factor authentication process. The bank's internal server logs proved unequivocally that the one-time verification passcode was never sent to my personal phone. Instead, the automated system sent the code to a secondary line on our family phone plan. The primary account holder, the person who paid the monthly bill and had exclusive access to those incoming text messages, was Elaine Bennett. Deeper within the heavily redacted stack of paper was a printed internal communication between two regional loan officers. It was a legally compelled disclosure that forced all the air out of my lungs. One employee had typed a highly specific note regarding a mandatory telephone verification interview. The note stated clearly that the borrower sounded remarkably confused about the terms, and that the mother, who was purportedly listening on a secondary line, had aggressively interjected and answered the majority of the financial questions on the applicant's behalf. My mother had literally hijacked a recorded bank interview, speaking entirely over me, while I sat on the other end of the telephone utterly oblivious to the fact that I was actively authorizing a massive lien against a property. Armed with that specific date and time from the bank's internal email, I spent my final hour at home frantically tearing through the digital archives of my phone carrier. I was hunting for any audio fragments from that specific week 2 years ago, buried beneath dozens of saved administrative reminders. I found a saved voicemail, barely 30 seconds in duration. At the time I initially received it, I had dismissed it as my mother's standard, overbearing nagging regarding some trivial family chore. But listening to it now, pressing the cold glass of my phone hard against my ear, the context was lethal. Her voice echoed through the absolute silence of my kitchen, dripping with false, impatient maternal warmth. She said, word for word, that I just needed to click sign on the digital link she had forwarded. She explicitly promised it was merely standard bank paperwork required to properly process the sale of my grandmother's house, and she assured me she would handle all the complicated details. It was the ultimate, indisputable smoking gun. It proved she had actively, purposefully directed me to execute a legal document under entirely false pretenses. But the bank ledgers revealed a truth far more sickening than the initial forgery. The records detailed the exact distribution of the stolen funds. The money had not simply vanished into a chaotic void of outstanding medical bills or emergency roofing contractors, as she had so tragically claimed to the extended family. The ledger showed a massive direct wire transfer from the fraudulent credit line into a newly established corporate checking account. The registered beneficiary of that account was Maple Thread Interiors Limited Liability Company. It was the exact custom design business my sister, Brooke, had launched 18 months ago. Brooke had tearfully bragged at a lavish family brunch that our mother had generously helped fund her entrepreneurial dream with a significant portion of her own retirement savings. The pristine, highly successful life of the golden child was directly subsidized by a felony committed against her younger sister. Then came the final blow, the one that truly broke my heart into jagged, irreparable pieces. A second, highly specific electronic transfer had been routed directly to the Internal Revenue Service (IRS). It was a substantial payment engineered to settle a massive, outstanding personal tax debt. The Social Security number attached to that specific tax liability belonged entirely to Thomas Bennett, my father, the quiet, passive man who sat silently at the head of the dinner table. The man who constantly fled to the garage to avoid conflict had directly, tangibly benefited from a loan forged in his youngest daughter's name. He had allowed his wife to magically clear his financial failures, and he had never once possessed the moral courage to ask where the sudden, life-saving windfall had come from. Or, perhaps much worse, he knew exactly where the money originated and chose the comfort of a zero balance over protecting his own flesh and blood. I immediately called Carmen Ives, my voice vibrating with a dangerous, chaotic mixture of profound grief and explosive rage. I told my lawyer I was ready to print every single page and hurl the entire binder across the dining room table the second I walked through the front door. Carmen stopped me with a voice that sounded like cracking ice. She strictly warned me against deploying my ammunition prematurely. If I threw the evidence out piece by piece, my mother would have the necessary oxygen to spin new lies, to claim clerical misunderstandings, and to deflect the blame onto banking errors. Carmen gave me my final, unbreakable directive. I had to wait. I had to let Elaine take the floor and publicly present her entire, fabricated accusation. I had to let her commit completely, irreversibly to the lie in front of every single witness in that house. Only when she had painted herself entirely into a corner, with no possible avenue of retreat, was I allowed to present the chronological proof. I was not going there to argue with her. I was going there to execute her narrative. I moved with the cold, mechanical, terrifying precision of a bomb technician. I took the single summary pages I had already prepared for the manila envelopes and carefully updated them, adding the new wire transfer data, the internal bank notes, and the authentication phone number. I printed fresh, razor-sharp copies. I counted them out, one for every adult who would be sitting in that oppressive circle. But paper could be easily crumpled, torn, or tossed aside by loyalists desperate to protect the matriarch. I needed a technological fail-safe. I loaded the high-resolution, completely unredacted digital scans of the bank files onto my tablet computer, ensuring the battery was fully charged and the screen timeout function was permanently disabled. Finally, I prepared for the audio reveal. I knew my mother's aggressive tactics intimately. If I attempted to play the voicemail from the tiny speaker on my cellular phone, she would simply start screaming to drown out the sound, or one of my aunts would loudly turn on the television to deliberately create chaos. I walked into my bedroom and retrieved a small, incredibly heavy, cylindrical wireless speaker. I synchronized it to my phone and tested the volume output. At maximum capacity, my mother's recorded voice was absolutely deafening, vibrating the floorboards beneath my feet. I slipped the heavy speaker into the bottom of my canvas tote bag, resting it right beside the stack of manila envelopes. The arsenal was fully assembled. I possessed the bank logs, the routing numbers, the corporate registries, and her own voice trapped in digital amber. Logically, it was an airtight, inescapable trap of my own making, completely reversing the one she had set for me. Yet, as I zipped my winter coat and slung the heavy canvas bag over my shoulder, my hands continued to tremble violently. The physical evidence was impenetrable, but I knew the impending battle in that living room was not truly about routing numbers, electronic signatures, or tax debts. I was walking into a house to fight a 20-year war against an entire family that had been meticulously, flawlessly conditioned to view me as the fundamentally flawed, untrustworthy child. I was terrified because I knew, deep in my bones, that even with the absolute, undeniable truth placed directly in their hands, some of them might still desperately choose the comfort of the lie. The scraping of the final dessert forks against porcelain signaled the end of the hollow charade. Right on cue, exactly as she had likely rehearsed in her head all morning. My mother stood up at the head of the dining table. She did not tap a glass with a knife. She simply clapped her hands together twice. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that instantly killed the low hum of forced conversation. She announced, in a voice dripping with saccharine sweetness that did not quite reach her eyes, that the children were to be ushered down into the finished basement. She had prepared a movie marathon and a secondary dessert station for them. It was time, she declared, for the adults to move into the living room and have a real family discussion. The migration was swift and completely obedient. I stood up slowly, picking up my heavy canvas tote bag from the floor beside my chair. The strap dug sharply into my shoulder, a grounding physical reminder of the heavy artillery I was carrying. I followed the procession of aunts, uncles, and cousins through the arched doorway. When I crossed the threshold into the living room, a cold wave of adrenaline washed over my chest. Leah had been absolutely right. The heavy mahogany coffee table had been violently shoved against the far wall, leaving deep indentations in the plush carpet. In its place, every available piece of seating had been dragged into a wide, inescapable circle. The floral armchairs, the love seat, my father's leather recliner, and the rigid metal folding chairs formed a perfect perimeter of judgment. Dead center, completely exposed and facing the largest cluster of seats, was a vast empty space clearly intended for the accused. The family filed in, taking their places with a nervous, hushed energy. I deliberately avoided the center of the room. I chose a metal folding chair on the absolute outer edge of the circle, dropping my heavy canvas bag onto the floor right between my boots. I sat down, keeping my spine perfectly rigid, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My mother took the wingback chair directly across from me. The room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Elaine reached into the pocket of her thick, cream-colored cardigan and slowly extracted the folded stack of papers I had been staring at all evening. She smoothed them out on her lap with deliberate, agonizing care. Then, she reached up and slipped her silver-rimmed reading glasses onto her nose. The transformation was instant and terrifying. She shifted from a suburban host to a weary, deeply wounded matriarch, carrying the weight of the world. She looked around the circle, making direct, sorrowful eye contact with her siblings. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a masterful piece of theatrical timing, and began to speak. She started by telling the room that she was completely exhausted. She said her heart was broken. She claimed she had spent the last 2 years quietly carrying a terrible burden to protect the peace of the family, but she simply could not do it anymore. She looked down at her hands, letting her voice crack just a fraction. She announced that she refused to allow every single holiday, every single sacred family gathering, to be threatened and poisoned by my relentless, ungrateful demands. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the older relatives. Aunt Susan pressed a hand to her chest. Uncle Richard shook his head in solemn disappointment. My mother had successfully established the emotional baseline she was the bleeding victim, and I was the ruthless aggressor. Then, she lifted the top sheet of paper. It was a highly detailed, self-drafted ledger. She adjusted her glasses and began to read aloud, presenting a complete, alternate reality of my financial history. She listed a fabricated timeline of times the family had supposedly stepped in to save me from my own chaotic incompetence. She read off a sudden rent shortfall from 4 years ago, citing a specific transfer of $850. She detailed a catastrophic car repair bill from 3 winters past, quoting an exact figure of $1,214.42. She listed various emergency support payments, always attaching an incredibly precise, uneven dollar amount. Finally, she arrived at the centerpiece of her lie. She read a massive, staggering sum that she claimed had been directly advanced to me from Grandma June's estate fund to cover my imaginary, spiraling debts. I sat frozen, listening to the sheer brilliance of her tactic. The numbers were not round, generic estimates. They were incredibly granular. They included odd cents and specific, believable context. That is the anatomy of the perfect lie. If you claim someone stole $10,000, people might ask for a bank statement. But if you claim someone needed exactly $412.16 to prevent their electricity from being shut off on a Tuesday in November, the sheer mundane specificity of the detail bypasses human skepticism. I watched my relatives nodding slowly, entirely seduced by the meticulous, fabricated data. The absolute injustice of it burned like acid in my throat. The urge to defend myself, to scream that I had never missed a rent payment in my entire adult life, clawed at the back of my mouth. I leaned forward slightly, breaking my own rule, and opened my mouth. "Mom, that is absolutely not true," I started to say. I barely managed to push 6 words into the air before her trap slammed completely shut. Elaine did not yell. She did not even look angry. She simply lowered the paper, looked at me over the rim of her glasses, and spoke in the calm, soothing, condescending tone one might use to scold an irrational toddler having a public tantrum. "You will have your turn to speak, Natalie," she said softly, but loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Please, do not perform for us right now. We are trying to have a civilized discussion." It was a flawless execution. With 2 sentences, she instantly weaponized my interjection. She framed my completely natural defense as an emotional outburst, successfully painting me as the volatile, out-of-control antagonist she had spent years describing to them. I clamped my jaw shut so hard my teeth ached. I leaned back in my metal chair, forced my face into a mask of total stone, and stared directly into her eyes. I let the silence stretch, refusing to give her the hysterical reaction she so desperately craved. Seeing that I was not going to take the bait and self-destruct, Elaine moved to the final phase of her plan. She placed the fabricated ledger onto the carpet and picked up the second document. I instantly recognized the thick paper Leah had photographed. It was the formal family resolution. Elaine cleared her throat, elevating her voice to reach the corners of the room. She announced that the family could no longer operate under this cloud of toxicity. She stated that she had drafted a formal agreement to settle the issue permanently. She read the terms aloud. The document mandated that I immediately and legally drop all unfounded financial claims against my grandmother's estate. In exchange, the family would formally forgive the massive debt I supposedly owed them. Furthermore, she added, her voice dropping to a grim whisper, the document stipulated my immediate removal from all future family gatherings. The air in the living room turned to lead. I looked slowly around the circle, taking inventory of the jury she had assembled. My father was sitting in his leather recliner, practically trying to sink through the upholstery. His eyes were glued to the baseboards. He was staring at a speck of dust on the wooden trim with absolute, unwavering intensity, choosing total blindness over defending his child. Brooke was sitting on the love seat, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist, her knuckles entirely white. Her face was tense, her eyes darting frantically between me and our mother. She looked terrified, caught between the sister she knew was innocent and the mother who held the financial keys to her entire business. Leah was seated 2 chairs away from me. She was leaning forward, her eyes wide and pleading, staring directly at my face. She was practically begging me with her posture to do something, to say something, to stop the runaway train. But I kept my hands folded. I felt the rough canvas of my tote bag brushing against my ankle. Elaine surveyed the room, absorbing the terrified, compliant silence of her siblings and children. She offered one final, tragic smile, securing her position as the reluctant executioner. "We cannot let this poison our lives any longer," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Therefore, for the peace of this family, and to finally put this painful chapter behind us, I am asking for a consensus. Please, everyone, prepare to cast your vote by raising your hands." Elaine finished reading the final sentence of the family resolution. She lowered the thick paper to her lap, looked around the room with a perfectly practiced expression of weary sorrow, and asked anyone who agreed with the terms to raise their right hand. The ensuing silence was absolute and suffocating. The only sound in the entire house was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the seconds of my impending execution. It took exactly 4 agonizing seconds for the first hand to rise. It was a fragile, trembling hand, severely spotted with age. It belonged to Aunt Helen. I stared at her thin wrist, instantly transported back to the countless Tuesday afternoons I had spent sitting beside her in sterile, freezing cardiology waiting rooms. I had taken time off from my own job, using my own vacation hours, to drive her to those appointments because her own children claimed they were simply too busy with their corporate schedules. I remembered holding that exact same hand while she wept in fear over an irregular echocardiogram. Now, that hand was raised high in the air to permanently banish me from the family. The profound betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic scream or a thrown object. It arrived in the deafening, compliant silence of an old woman choosing the winning side to secure her own comfort. After Aunt Helen cast the first stone, the floodgates completely opened. It was a rapid, sickening domino effect of cowardice. Uncle Richard raised his hand, refusing to look in my direction. Cousin Mark, a man who had not spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences to me in over 5 years, firmly raised his hands went up from distant relatives who lived 3 states away, people who possessed absolutely zero first-hand knowledge of the estate finances or the timeline of my grandmother's death. They did not vote based on empirical evidence or logical deduction. They voted based purely on gravity. Elaine was the massive, scorching sun of this family, and they were simply terrified planets desperate not to fall out of her orbit. Every single raised hand felt like a physical, heavy blow pressing down on my chest, slowly compressing my lungs until I could barely draw a breath. I shifted my gaze toward the love seat. Brooke was sitting rigidly, staring directly down at her own knees. She was the one person in this room who truly understood the dark mechanics of our mother's cruelty. I watched the frantic, panicked pulse beating visibly at the base of her throat. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I genuinely thought my sister might abstain. I thought the suffocating guilt of her fully funded interior design business might finally outweigh her lifelong terror of our mother's wrath. But then, Brooke squeezed her eyes tightly shut, took a sharp, shallow breath, and raised her trembling hand into the air. She deliberately chose her pristine, custom-built, heavily subsidized lifestyle over the unseen truth. She chose the familiar, safe order of Elaine's tyranny over her own sister. Only my father remained. Thomas Bennett sat perfectly still in his oversized leather recliner. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the patriarch to seal the final verdict. He kept his head bowed low, his chin practically resting against his collarbone. He absolutely refused to look at me. He could not bring himself to look at the daughter whose financial identity had been secretly sacrificed to pay off his massive personal tax debts. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his right hand just a few inches off the leather armrest. It was a pathetic, cowardly, half-hearted gesture, but it counted. That tiny, subtle movement shattered the very last remaining pillar of my childhood. I felt my knees weaken against the metal legs of my folding chair. I was entirely, completely alone in a room packed full of my own blood. Elaine did not just let the visual of the raised hands linger in the air. She weaponized the moment by formally counting them aloud. She pointed her manicured index finger around the circle, her voice thick with dark, undeniable satisfaction. 1, 2, 3, 4. She enunciated every single number as if she were manually driving a heavy steel nail into my coffin. She counted slowly, deliberately, all the way to 14. 14 adults, 100% of the room. She lowered her own hand and folded her arms across her cashmere sweater. The false, tragic sorrow completely vanished from her tone, instantly replaced by the cold, hard steel of absolute victory. She announced that the decision was unanimous. She looked directly into my eyes and declared that I no longer possessed the right to demand anything from this family, and that the matter was permanently, legally closed. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped the living room instantly evaporated, replaced by a collective, cowardly sigh of relief from the relatives. The execution was over. The disruptive monster had been successfully slain. I stood up slowly from my metal folding chair. My legs felt like they were made of solid lead. I turned my back on the circle of my betrayers and took 3 slow, heavy steps toward the arched doorway leading out to the front hall. I walked directly toward the wooden coat rack. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my car keys, resting quietly on the entryway console table. This was exactly what my mother wanted. This was the final, triumphant stage of her meticulously written script. I was supposed to run away into the freezing November night, thoroughly humiliated and broken, leaving her with absolutely no witnesses to challenge her newly established reality. But before my fingers could fully grasp the keychain, Elaine called out. Her voice was sharp, commanding, and entirely unable to resist one final, unnecessary twist of the knife. She told me that before I left her house, I needed to formally sign the family resolution. She held out a heavy silver pen, pointing it directly at the blank line waiting at the bottom of her fabricated document. She wanted my ultimate physical submission captured in ink in front of her entire captive audience. I stopped, my fingers curled away from the metal keys. I took one deep, incredibly steadying breath, feeling a wave of cold, hard certainty completely solidify in my veins. I turned around slowly to face the room. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly at my mother, completely ignoring the silver pen she was holding suspended in the air. "I will not sign," I said. My voice cut through the quiet, relieved room like a diamond blade. The absolute terrifying calm in my tone made several relatives physically flinch. I did not break eye contact with Elaine as I delivered my final instruction. "And before you finalize this vote, I want each of you to reach down and open the envelope placed directly beneath your chair." The entire living room froze in a state of absolute, paralyzed confusion. Relatives darted nervous glances at one another, then slowly, hesitantly, leaned forward to peer under their seats. A sharp, audible gasp erupted from Aunt Helen as her frail fingers brushed against heavy manila paper. During the chaotic, crowded, noisy migration from the dining room to the living room, while everyone was entirely distracted by the children being herded downstairs, I had quietly and systematically slipped the thick packets under every single seat in the circle. Not a single person had noticed my movements. As the loud, tearing rustle of heavy paper began to echo rapidly around the room, I watched my mother's face. For the very first time in my entire 32 years of existence, the smug, unshakable, arrogant confidence completely drained from Elaine's features, instantly replaced by a look of raw, naked, undeniable panic. The sound of heavy manila paper tearing filled the room like a sudden flock of startled birds. Every single adult in the circle pulled out the single sheet of paper I had placed at the front of their packet. I had designed it to be completely undeniable, broken down into 3 stark, bolded sections. The first section detailed the fraudulent line of credit opened exclusively under my name. The second section displayed the certified IP access logs, pointing directly to the house we were currently sitting in. The third section mapped the exact agonizing flow of the stolen funds from the bank directly into 2 very specific accounts, before anyone could even digest the second paragraph. Elaine shot out of her wingback chair. Her face was flushed a violent, mottled red. She pointed a trembling finger at the papers and shrieked that it was all entirely fabricated. She screamed that I had printed fake documents from the internet to ruin her. I did not raise my voice to argue. Arguing requires 2 equal sides, and we were no longer equals. I reached into my canvas bag, pulled out my tablet, and tapped the screen mirroring icon. The massive television mounted above the fireplace instantly flashed from a blank black screen to a blinding white document. It was the certified, notarized compliance package straight from the bank. I zoomed in on the electronic signature audit log. I highlighted the 2-factor authentication sequence. The text on the massive screen clearly showed the security passcode being sent to a phone number ending in the exact 4 digits of my mother's private phone line. "Uncle Richard, sitting closest to the fireplace, squinted through his glasses and began to read the timestamps out loud. He read that the final signature was executed at 14 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I calmly instructed everyone to turn to the second page in their envelopes. It was a verified, stamped copy of my hospital scheduling matrix and the security badge swipe logs from the emergency room. Uncle Richard's voice completely died in his throat as he realized I was physically managing a psychiatric hold case, surrounded by hospital security cameras and nursing staff. At the exact minute my mother claimed I was sitting at a computer stealing money from the family, Elaine opened her mouth to pivot, to invent a new lie about network errors, but I cut her off entirely. I pulled the heavy cylindrical wireless speaker from the bottom of my bag, set it down on the floor next to my boots, and pressed play on my cellular phone. My mother's own voice exploded into the living room, completely uncompressed and deafeningly loud. "Natalie, honey, you just need to click sign on that link I sent. It is just a standard form the bank needs to finally process the deed for your grandmother's house. Do not worry about reading all the legal jargon. I will handle all of it for you." The audio recording echoed off the hardwood floors and died. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and utterly absolute. I did not need to explain anything. The blow had not come from my accusations. It had been delivered entirely by her own recorded deception. A sharp, ragged gasp tore through the quiet. I looked over at the love seat. Brooke had reached the third section of the summary page, the document tracking the wire transfers. Her perfectly manicured fingernails were digging so deeply into the paper that it was beginning to tear. She was staring at a specific line item showing a massive cash infusion routed directly into the corporate account for Maple Thread Interiors Limited Liability Company. It was the exact capital she had used to finally open her high-end bridal showroom. The color completely drained from my sister's face as the horrifying reality set in. The beautiful, generous gift our mother had claimed was pulled from her own hard-earned retirement savings was actually stolen directly from my financial future. Brooke dropped the paper onto the floor as if it were physically burning her skin, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Beside her, my father was staring at his own customized packet. He was not looking at Brooke's business ledger. He was staring at the second major wire transfer. The payment sent directly to the Federal Revenue Service, explicitly clearing a massive, crushing personal tax penalty he had been secretly drowning under for years. Thomas Bennett slowly lifted his head, his eyes glassy and completely hollowed out. He realized in that exact moment that the sudden financial miracle his wife had provided him was not a miracle at all. He had directly, tangibly benefited from a felony committed against his youngest daughter, and his lifelong strategy of passive ignorance had made him an active accomplice to the theft. Cornered, with the undeniable proof displayed on the television, echoing from the speaker, and resting in the hands of her siblings, Elaine's entire demeanor shattered. The cold, righteous matriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. She completely abandoned the narrative that the documents were fake. Instead, she threw her hands into the air and began to sob. It was a chaotic, wet, entirely performative weeping. She cried out that she had only done it for the family. She wailed that Grandma June would have wanted the money to go towards saving Thomas from federal ruin and helping Brooke establish her business. She pointed frantically around the room, screaming that everyone sitting in those chairs had benefited from her sacrifice, and that she was the only one brave enough to do what was necessary to keep them all afloat. It was the final nail in her own coffin. By desperately trying to justify the theft with emotional manipulation, she explicitly, undeniably, confessed to the crime in front of 14 witnesses. But this time, her tears held absolutely no currency. The gravity in the room had fundamentally shifted. Not a single person in that circle was looking at her. Aunt Helen was staring down at her lap, her face pale with profound shame. Uncle Richard stood up slowly from his metal chair, refused to look at his sister, and quietly walked out of the living room toward the kitchen. Cousin Mark followed him without saying a word. The people who had confidently raised their hands just minutes prior to banish me were now completely unable to meet my gaze, suffocated by the heavy guilt of their blind loyalty to a thief. Brooke was quietly sobbing into her hands on the love seat. My father simply sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall, utterly broken by the weight of his own complicity. Elaine stood in the center of the room, crying loudly, begging for someone to validate her, but she was entirely, profoundly alone. I reached down and picked up the printed family resolution she had tried to force me to sign. I did not tear it into dramatic pieces. I did not throw it in her face. I calmly stepped forward and placed it gently on the center of the coffee table she had shoved against the wall. I looked around the remaining family members and spoke with total, unshakable clarity. Nobody in this family is ever permitted to discuss my finances, my career, or my life choices again. As of tomorrow morning, any and all matters regarding the estate of June Whitaker will be handled exclusively through my attorney, Carmen Ives. Her contact information is listed at the bottom of your summary pages. And if any of you ever want to have a relationship with me again, you will not do it with empty words or holiday invitations. You will do it by proving, through your actions, that you understand exactly what you participated in tonight. I picked up my canvas bag. It felt incredibly light. I turned my back on the room and walked down the hallway. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing, sharp November wind hit my face, and it felt like the cleanest breath of air I had taken in my entire life. I was not being chased out in disgrace. I was walking out on my own terms, carrying the absolute truth. As I walked down the icy driveway toward my car, I could hear the absolute silence emanating from the house behind me. There was no screaming, no arguing, no coordinated narrative being spun. The only sound left in that living room was the soft, undeniable rustling of certified bank documents. And sitting right in the center of that wreckage was my mother, surrounded by people who finally lacked the courage to ever look her in the eye again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and hit the hype button so more people can hear it.